Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrew Clark. I direct the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy here at the University of Connecticut, Hartford branch. And you are now participating in the third in the series of public dialogues regarding the Police Transparency and Accountability Task Force here in Connecticut. Their final report, which was issued at the beginning of this year in 2022, and included recommendations, much of which are on the legislative calendar, a few of which were administrative. And we are here to discuss today the recommendations relative to diversity in policing. So welcome. As I mentioned, this is the third in the series. The other two are April 18th and April 25th. Those addressed policing and social work and racial profiling, in particular, primary and secondary traffic stops. You can find more about the past sessions and this session, including the panelist bios and information on the panel on the Police Transparency website. That's ctpolicetransparency.com. This video should be on CTN as well, and CTN has covered the past two sessions, and you can find the CTN videos on the website too, as well as CTN's website. So today we're here to discuss diversity in policing. A little bit about today's panel. Law enforcement in the U.S. has never reflected the racial, ethnic, or gender diversity of communities they serve. Racial and ethnic diversity is especially non-representative in cities with historically high rates of minorities. This is true in Connecticut, where the 8 largest cities have a combined white population of less than 50%, and yet the forces are nearly 75% white. What is the benefit of demographic diversity in policing? And what about ideological and disability diversity as well? The Police Transparency Task Force final report provided several recommendations aimed at improving diversity within Connecticut's law enforcement community. This conversation will highlight those recommendations in the context of the national conversation. How it's going to go today is, after my brief introduction, I'll introduce Dr. Ann Kringen, who will have about a 10 to 15 minute presentation on those recommendations relative to the task force, and then we'll have a moderated panel with moderator Andrew Brown, investigative reporter from the CT Mirror. This is the 14th, by the way, public listening session that the task force has held. Aside from the other two that I talked about, the others were in conjunction with developing the recommendations. Now that the task force has finalized its report, it actually no longer exists per the state statute that created it. However, the task force did decide in its last meeting earlier this year that it would continue on with implementation recommendations from the final report. And that's why we're having these series of conversations, one to educate about those recommendations, but another is to be able to cast a wide net to get an understanding of what others in the state and nationally are doing on these particular issues to help us in the implementation guide and make recommendations for doing so in local communities here in Connecticut. So as I mentioned, we're going to start off with Dr. Ann Kringen. Dr. Kringen is an associate professor of criminal justice at the University of New Haven, where she has served as both assistant chair of the Department of Criminal Justice and the assistant dean of the Henry Lee College of Criminal Justice and Forensic Sciences. Her personal research focuses on policing, specifically organizational issues that affect diversification. An evidence-based policy advocate, she seeks to conduct research that bridges the gap between critical perspectives on race and gender and policing through policy change. And through her work there, she was identified to assist the task force in its diversity recommendations. Those diversity recommendations came primarily from the Public Awareness Subcommittee. There were 3 subcommittees within the task force. The Public Awareness, as I mentioned, covered the diversity recommendations. And so Dr. Kringen received her Ph.D. in criminal justice from Texas State University. She proudly served as a peace officer in Alexandria, Virginia, making her a well-rounded, intelligent choice. In 2021, The Austin, Texas Police Department welcomed Dr. Kringen to the department as the new APD Training Academy Division Manager. In APD, Dr. Kringen plays a significant role in revising the APD Police Cadet Program as part of the reimagining public safety process. And you may notice her and recognize her from 60 Minutes, November 21, 2021, had a segment on reimagining policing departments with safety and justice in mind. And so, Dr. Kringen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and I look forward to hearing the perspectives from our panelists. I'm going to do a brief presentation regarding the first 4 recommendations from the Police Transparency and Accountability Task Force relating to diversity. So let me go ahead and share screen and get started. So as Andrew discussed, in terms of diversification, particularly within Connecticut, Connecticut has followed the same trends as many police departments nationally, where we've looked at not a lot of increased diversification, although we do see more diversity in larger agencies in Connecticut than smaller agencies. So just wanted to present the general demographics of law enforcement agencies in Connecticut, in both all agencies, right? And we know that within the state of Connecticut, that most agencies are smaller departments and that we have a few larger agencies. And I'm happy that we have representation from individuals nested in those agencies. But as you can see, still mostly white individuals make up policing within the state of Connecticut. And so one of the things that I think is really important to briefly discuss is, why does it matter, right? We have a lot of discussions related to diversification, and the 2 ways that we generally have looked at diversity within law enforcement have been related to race as well as gender. And so there have been some studies that have come out in the last couple of years really supporting the differences between officers. And this is, of course, on average, looking at where the studies have suggested that Black and Hispanic officers use less force than white officers, and Black and Hispanic officers make fewer stops and fewer arrests than white officers, right? And also in terms of gender, I'm really happy that Ivonne Roman from 30 by 30 is here, where she'll be able to talk about some of the research related to gender diversification, but also that we see the same types of patterns within female officers, less likely to use force, right, than their male officers, and less likely to receive complaints and engage in misconduct. So there are these benefits related to diversification in law enforcement. However, the next thing that I think is also really important, and something that I think the task force took on that was a little bit different, is that there's more than, we want to think about diversification more than just race and gender, but also ideology, right? Is that we understand that organizations make better decisions if they have diversity at the table, right? In terms of ideology. So then you can flush out kind of the critical perspectives internally to come up with the best decisions as an organization. So that's something that we included for our first recommendation, was having the discussion on ideology as well. And so, as I mentioned, in the end, we want to think about these things as not just race and gender, but also ideology. And that ideology can come from different perspectives of different individuals. Jon Slifka will talk about disability and making sure that we're inclusive and how we think about different communities. And so when we think about those perspectives, we can think about how we best serve our community, and that departments can tackle those questions internally to be able to think about the changes that a lot of communities in the last few years have been asking for. So I'm going to talk about the recommendations. And so the first one was related to diversification and community involvement goals. And so we specifically addressed amending Connecticut General Statute 7-291B to stipulate diversification and community involvement goals within each law enforcement agency in Connecticut's written directives that are reviewed for accreditation by CALEA, right, or the state post-C tiered accreditation programs. Right, we wanted to make sure that if we're talking about diversification, that we're really tackling at a state level and having post really take that on as part of accreditation, right? Are we having community engagement as part of accreditation? Are we asking agencies if they're being involved, and then how are they doing that? And then at the state level, being able to sort of compare and contrast what those involvement plans look like. The second recommendation is a little bit more robust, but relating to state level dissemination of promising practices to support diversification. I'm really interested in talking to the various panelists and hearing their perspectives through the moderator related to this, right? Which is the fact that, and especially Ivonne's work with 30 by 30, how do we disseminate what works? Because a lot of times we've seen that law enforcement agencies are doing the same things that they've maybe been doing over the last 15 years. We know with kind of recruiting and hiring challenges currently that you might have to do things differently, but also that these doing things differently practices really do have to support diversification, right? There's one more recent research using randomized control trials suggesting that there are ways through whether email nudging, right, or various images to actually think about how are we capturing the right applicants that are going to be, how are we increasing the number of applicants to think about widening the bucket for applications, right, to have a more diverse pool of applicants, but also what are the ways that we sort of funnel individuals out of the system of applying, right, either through selection out or the actual process themselves, and what are the things that we actually can do. I've done a few smaller scale studies related to this, but we also know that, for example, within gender, this isn't a homogenous group, right? And so being able to reach out to applicants, right? College age women who are interested in applying will have different reasons of why they're choosing the career than someone else who's maybe had an established career prior, right? And so really the things that you're going to talk about related to policing and law enforcement are going to be different, as well as the concerns, right? And so making sure that we're giving agencies sort of that information so that they can think about what are they doing and how are they messaging, right? And this goes throughout the entire process, right? When we talked about this and said state level dissemination and promising practices to support diversification, it wasn't just that hiring recruiting side. It was also thinking about what about promotion and training. And you can see the photo that there is two individuals in a police car, but what about sort of that on the ground training that usually is field training is, potentially a barrier, and what ways do we have agencies reconsider the ways that they train both in the academy but also in the on-the-job experience. And so I'm interested in hearing the panelists' perceptions related to that, because many of them have experiences that would allow us to understand this more holistically. The third recommendation is establishing a diversity, equity, inclusion unit within POST. The Connecticut Police Officer Standards and Training Council should be able to establish a unit. They have one related to compliance and to really address DEI, being able to have someone sort of nested who has that lens, right? I would say that for me in my current role, working for a city municipality law enforcement, that it's been really advantageous for the agency to have someone who has this lens within the department, right? And we see that these types of roles are created in many different types of law enforcement agencies, and also creating it within posts so that they can understand those promising practices, right, that at the state level that we're pushing out, but also what are the ways that we can support agencies being able to do that, right? Looking at their plans when it comes to compliance and accreditation, right? If we're able to say, hey, we want to be able to have diversity, right, within and community engagement as part of their accreditation plans, right? What is sort of the support and feedback that these agencies are getting about whether these plans will actually work and what they're doing to be able to do so. So that is our third recommendation, is establishing a DEI unit within Post C. And we also acknowledge that this may mean an increase in funding or other types of prioritization to make this happen. So I think that is part of the role or the goal of having this discussion, is to talk about not just ideology about what we want to do, but how do we actually do this, and how do we actually make sure that the state of Connecticut has the support to do this for Connecticut agencies. And then the final recommendation is related to civilian presence within police departments. When pulling up the LEMAS data, which is for law enforcement, that's sent out every 4 years to law enforcement agencies, you can actually find the diversification related to sworn staff, but we actually have no idea how diverse our civilian staff nested within these police departments is. We actually also don't know from an aggregate state level what civilians do in these departments, right? So I think this is sort of exploring what they're doing, but also realizing that civilian staff can help increase that goal of ideology of having just a different perspective within law enforcement. And so thinking about who is in those roles, right? What are they doing within those roles? And then what ways in which, can they support sworn staff in being able to accomplish the goals for law enforcement? So I'm going to conclude now for the presentation part. I think the most exciting part is usually not the presentation for these panels, but really sort of diving into the panelists' perspectives on this. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer questions and have a discussion related to this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kringen. As you mentioned, we'll now go on to the panel, and I will introduce the panelists briefly. The full bios, as I mentioned, are on the website ctpolicetransparency.com. You can look at the listening sessions tab for the full bios. But we're really excited and thankful for the individuals who are joining us today and giving their time for this discussion. The first of which is Dr. Lorenzo Boyd, who is a nationally recognized expert in police community relationships and an authority on urban policing. Dr. Boyd currently serves as the Stewart Professor of Criminal Justice and Community Policing at the University of New Haven. His 14-year service as a deputy sheriff in Boston informs his 20-year career in higher education, where he effectively translates research and theory into practice, making him a sought-after consultant, trainer, and speaker for departments and communities across the country. He conducts professional development training with a central focus on building levels of empathy, lived experience, and cultural competence among police personnel. He works with police leaders around the country to determine training needs and develops interactive professional development sessions that include real-life scenarios and role play. He's a life member of NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, and the former president of the Academy of Criminal Justice Science. That's Dr. Boyd. We also have with us Sergeant Steve Austin, who's a true native son of the city of Hartford. He was born, raised, and attended Hartford Public Schools, graduating from Weaver High School and then Greater Hartford Community College. He joined the Hartford Police Department as a recruit in 2004. Upon graduation from the Police Academy, Sergeant Austin was assigned to walk beat in the neighborhoods of his youth in the northeast sections of Hartford. It was here he began to build new community relations and strengthen existing ones with business owners, local clergy, residents that knew him from his time as a youth, as well as the new generation of children that lived and played in the neighborhoods he served. In 2013, Sergeant Austin was assigned to the Hartford Shooting Task Force before being promoted to the rank of sergeant and reassigned to the Special Operations Group by Chief James Ravella. In 2018, Sergeant Austin was assigned to head the Community Response Unit until his most recent assignment as the supervisor in the Career Development Division. Welcome, Sergeant Austin. Also, we have with us Ivonne Roman, who has 25 years of experience in policing, serving in every rank from police officer to chief in the Newark Police Department. That's in New Jersey. Ivonne Roman earned a Master of Public Administration with distinction in 2017 and a Master of Science in Public Affairs and Public Policy in 2020 from Rutgers Camden, and has completed coursework for a Ph.D. in Public Affairs and Development. She was awarded journalism intern at the Marshall Project in 2018 and was awarded a 2019 TED Talks Fellowship for advocacy work to improve outcomes for women in policing. And in March 2021, Roman and Maureen McGaw of the New York University Policing Project co-founded the 30 by 30 initiative to increase the representation of women in policing to 30% by 2030, and now have over 150 partnering police agencies, including some here in Connecticut. Next, we have Jon Slifka. Jonathan currently serves as Executive Assistant to the Commissioner of the Department of Aging and Disability Services. He also serves as the Chair of the Improving Police Interactions with the Disability Community Subcommittee on the PTATF, which we call it the task force. He holds a bachelor's degree in communication from St. Andrew's Presbyterian College in Laurinburg, North Carolina. Current resident of West Hartford, Mr. Slifka previously served as the chair of the West Hartford Democratic Town Committee, as well as a former member of the West Hartford Advisory Commission for persons with disabilities. Chief Vern Riddick is with us as well, and he was born and raised in Waterbury and is a graduate of JFK High School. He went on to earn a bachelor's degree in political science from Tufts in Boston and attended Rutgers University Law School and has earned his master's degree in public administration from Post in Waterbury. He began his law enforcement career in 1993 as a police officer in Ansonia, Connecticut. In December '94, he was hired by the Waterbury Police Department, and he was initially assigned to patrol, where he served as a field training officer. He was promoted in 2000 to the rank of sergeant and assigned a supervisor in patrol. In 2004, he was promoted to lieutenant, and in 2006, he was promoted to the rank of captain, and in November 2009, he was promoted to deputy chief, and in 2013, he was the acting chief, and in October of 2013, he was promoted to the chief of police. He is currently vice president of the Connecticut Police Chiefs Association and was recently reappointed to the post, which oversees training and certification for all municipal police officers in the state of Connecticut. He also serves as president for the Connecticut chapter of Noble. Lastly, is an adjunct faculty member of University of New Haven. And he currently is chief in West Hartford. Moderator is Andrew Brown. Andrew joined Connecticut Mirror as an investigative reporter in July 2021. Prior to moving to Connecticut, Andrew was a reporter at newspapers in North Dakota, West Virginia, and most recently, South Carolina. He's covered businesses, utilities, environmental issues, and the opioid crisis, as well as local government and 2 state legislatures. Thank you, panelists. I apologize for the length of the introduction, but I just wanted everybody to know, including those on CTN, the breadth of experience and that we have with us and expertise. And now I'll pass it off to you, Andrew.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and I'm really excited to be part of this panel and listen to everything that's going to happen here. So let's get right to it. We'll start with the recommendations of the task force report on diversity. And as we already went over, the first one is simply how to increase and improve diversification and community involvement. All of you have different experiences and different takes on this, I'm sure, but maybe we could start with Sergeant Austin and Chief Riddick, who are obviously in the field still. How do you think that police forces and law enforcement agencies can go about increasing and maintaining these diversity goals?
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me, first of all. Oh, wow. That's such a wide question. It's got a lot of different variables that we can talk about in terms of increasing diversity in law enforcement. Here in the city of Hartford, I can only speak to my experiences. And one of the things that I like to do is reach down not just to the high school, but to the junior high school and the elementary school levels, but also speaking to parents. And I tend to focus on education and economics. We talk about increasing that diversity, but a lot of it, in my experience, has just been performative. I mean, it looks good. You always have one guy here, one guy there, one woman here, one woman there, especially in Black and brown communities. But there's so many other outstanding issues that hinder our ability to recruit Black and brown individuals in these communities. A lot of it is misinformation and misconceptions of what law enforcement really is. I speak to people on a daily basis, and I talk to individuals, and their stories and their narratives are not being heard in these conversations. And it's great that we're doing this panel, but once again, the people who are really most impacted are not here. The studies are great, the data collection is great, but I noticed in the initial thing, we have one of the questions, and we have 169 towns, but the cities that we seem to have the most issues are Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, and Waterbury as well, and now New Britain. But the problems that you have in those cities, it seeps out to those suburbs and those rural areas. And I think as a society, we're coming to a head. I mean, I think this is gonna, the accountability, we just have to change perceptions and those narratives about what law enforcement really is. And I like to think that, you know, I hear this a lot of people who say, well, we don't like accountability. Well, I always felt accountability was there anyway, but the silence was deafening. And that happens with side agencies. You know, we did circle the wagons around the bad police, so to speak, in my opinion. I don't know if that's happened in every agency, but I know I've seen across the board where we would try to explain things away as opposed to being as transparent as we could have. But as I reach out to some of these young men and women now, we are having those conversations, and I think we're finding more and more who are receptive to that, looking at it from an economic standpoint where they can better themselves, better the position of their families, and also better the position of their communities. And when they look at it from that point of view, I'm finding more people willing to listen to what I have to say and what law enforcement can offer them. The whole nonsense of defund the police, I think it makes for great sound bites, but the reality is our communities will be impacted the most. Those are the things that you talk about, the realities, as opposed to, you know, protesting and marching and all that other stuff. We need more funding. We need more resources, not just to law enforcement, but to all the social programs that we see are suffering. And I think this year, 2022 and 2024, is going to be a huge referendum on what direction this country, not just our communities, but this country goes in terms of what they believe law enforcement really is. And that's going to be very interesting. And I think that's beyond my capacity right now, but I'm going to continue to do what I do in terms of trying to recruit young men and women, or not just young men and women, but some more mature folks who could be stakeholders in this conversation.
How do you, so I guess the question, my follow-up question there would be, how do you convince people who may have a perception of what police is, even if they're in the pipeline and you are connecting with them, how do you get them to the point where they say, this is a career that I may actually want to take? If they have those preconceived notions about what policing writ large is.
If I could jump in, Sarge did a good job.
Yep.
Part of that is talking about the true history of policing, and there's many positives post George Floyd, but one of the most significant positives was we really started to talk about how policing really started in the United States, the impacts of policing, the slave patrols, all the way up through Jim Crow and everything else, things that we're aware of, and an acknowledgement by law enforcement that this is actually occurring. We are now doing this at post, given the true history of policing. And once you acknowledge things, that lets people know is a recognition and a corrective action and a pathway going forward. Secondly, we're talking about recruitment and diversification. You know, when I left Waterbury in 2018, I was the chief there for 5.5 years. That last year, our entire team, HR, PD, the mayor's office, the community, for the first time, we were told in the history of our recruitment, we had more persons of color apply than we did the majority. It was like 53 to 47, somewhere around there percentage wise. How did we do that? We showed a unified front, and we really pushed the onus on our personnel, word of mouth. And I saw it in one of the emails. Word of mouth is the best recruiting tool, period. And we have to get our officers of color to talk about the positive impacts and parts of these jobs going forward. Here in West Hartford, since 2018 through now, 40% of our hires have been either women or persons of color, following that same model, personal outreach from myself and other people here, and really pushing the line, sending out emails and following up. We know email is not the best form of communication, but when you follow up and do it again and again, people are like, wow, they really care. And I'll close with this. You know, I'm not sure if you can see the contrast here. I'll try, it's probably not going to work, but this is part of a recruitment tool. It's a white pen and it says West Hartford PD. And we hand this out to our kids and say, hey, be part of us. And we didn't know we were doing this. Well, 3 years ago, we changed it. So now, again, I'm not sure if you can tell, but now we have different shades of this pen with our kids. And even you, if you can see, can be chief looking like me. And these are the things over time, it's not going to be finished with a magic wand. Over time, we can continue to make impacts in our community.
Would anybody else like to take a stab at that of, I guess, just how you start down this path of actually setting up the goals of having more diversity and community involvement?
Andrew, let me jump in here. One of the things that I notice is the more you have the police engaged with the community in non-enforcement ways, the more you have police officers and community members in some sort of dialogue and some sort of engagement, it helps the community members understand that they're just not an occupying army. At the University of New Haven in criminal justice, we've got a police sciences concentration. And I spend a lot of time trying to convince students, even now post George Floyd, that for the right person, policing is a fantastic career opportunity. And if we can get them to see the positives, and then I tell my students, I don't need you to change the world. I just need you to be the most ethical, most professional person you can be going into policing. And that's a pathway forward. So getting police officers and community members to engage in non-enforcement ways, that's the first step in moving forward.
I do have one question.
Jump in really quick, one last point. And thank you, Dr. Boyd, for reminding me. The other part of this is there's a huge onus on law enforcement, public safety, but it's an onus on the public too. I know in the Black and Brown community, you are ostracized for taking this job. And it's not looked as an awesome, great opportunity to provide for your family, good pay, medical. It's looked like, oh my gosh, you know, you're a traitor by taking it. We have to change that narrative. one thing Dr. King did, he used the system to expose the system. And you need to be part of the process and get involved if you want to make change. Thank you.
Where do you, I guess my general question in all of this is where do you set up your pipelines for new candidates? Is it within the communities that you're policing? Is there community colleges such as what Sergeant Austin came from? What are the pipelines that you find diverse candidates? And is it a problem of just finding them, or is it a problem of actually hiring? Which is the bigger problem?
I jump in. I think the community colleges are a great example. I just hosted I was a part of a panel just last Thursday with community college students from across the state that Capital Community College put together. And we talked just about these issues, but also it has to be more than performative. I can recruit a lot of individuals, and one of the most important things is that we still have a culture sometimes, and there are gatekeepers. I think there are still gatekeepers in law enforcement who don't see our Black and brown community as police officers. And to go back to what Chief Riddick was speaking about in terms of the perception of that you may be a sellout if you become a police officer. And I often counter that. I had a young man say to me, he says, well, how could you arrest people, or you're oppressing people? I said, well, listen, if I'm arresting you, I'm holding you accountable for your actions. But at the end of the day, I can point to several people who actually committed felonies against their own community. And so I'm like, would you rather me arrest you, or would you rather have you committing a felony against your own Black and brown people right here in other words, preying on your own community? And when they thought about it, they came back to a concession that, Sergeant, you're right. When I think about it in that way, I could be that change. I could be something that I thought I couldn't, because I got to be honest, as a young man growing up, and I was a teenager in the 70s. And I watched a documentary about World War II. I love history. So the stories that the survivors of the Holocaust were telling was that many people try to discredit their experiences. And when we recognize, and and Chief also spoke about this, you have to have that experience. They have to, these experiences happen. These things actually happen to individuals. And we often focus on incidents like George Floyd because that was caught on camera. I can speak from personal experience. There have been many instances that were never, ever caught on camera, but they occurred. When we have those kind of true and transparent conversations, and just, not being defensive, like, oh, we don't do that, we don't do that. Hey, it happened. These people experienced that. Let's move forward. How can we make it better? And those are the things when we talk about getting individuals to buy in. You have to, their stories have validity. And to get, our grandfathers and our fathers and our young men and young women to move in this direction and realize they could be the change in their communities. Because, going back to the economics that, like I said, the chief always says, it's a great opportunity. I put 2 kids through college already. So I know the opportunities to take care of your family, are there. And I want to push that on to other young men and women, particularly here in your own city, where your family has been here for multiple generations paying taxes. So no one's giving you anything. No one's giving you anything. And I think there has always been a gatekeeper or barrier, seen and unseen, that said, this job was not for you. These economic opportunities are not for you. And then framing that so that you would never want to come to this job. And that's the misinformation that we often talk about. But I think going forward, there's many opportunities, just getting down into the schools. I think, early. I think, especially in these communities, if you wait until high school, you've lost a lot of young men and women who could have possibly or potentially been candidates. So if we get on the elementary school level, and I love the ideas with the pen, Chief. I'm gonna have to get some of those pens. I like that. But yeah, you have to see that representation. And when you see that, you know you can be that. We had a thing here, my sister is very good. We had a Black Health Day where we brought in all kind of health clinicians from all across the state, but they were of color. They were all Black and brown. So when our children can see Black and brown health clinicians, doctors, all kind of medical professionals, they see it, they can be it, and that's huge. I mean, we only see athletes right now. We only see basketball and football players. So what do our kids want to be? They want to be basketball and football players. They only see rappers, so they want to be rappers. You know, so those other opportunities that we've been locked out of, we don't see that. We don't see that economic opportunities in those areas, which are really the transformative jobs. So those are the things that we need to push for. And I think having these kind of conversations, but more than conversations, because I've been on so many panels and so many conversations. I mean, action. And my dad was very big on action, because at the end of the day, you can sit here and talk all you want, but if we don't have the action, and I don't believe we can legislate this. And I like the whole post, the DIE thing in the post, but you cannot legislate change. It has to be from a conviction that this is the right thing to do.
So great segue to the second point here, which is how do you disseminate, once you have a system that's working and starting to increase diversity, how do you disseminate those practices? I guess I'll start with Ivonne and your work with trying to increase diversity with women in law enforcement. How do you make sure that the best practices are being shared and being adopted elsewhere?
So with the 30 by 30 initiative, we have over 150 police agencies that have signed on. And what we're trying to do is to create this community of practice where chiefs are sharing what works and what hasn't worked, right? And so that they can learn these lessons and try to identify which ones have the most impact, the most bang for your buck. What we try to do is provide no cost and low cost solutions in order to increase the number of women in policing. So what we've seen is like Vermont State Police, they've created nursing rooms for the moms, but they didn't just create it, they also put it out there, right? They did a little snippet and they advertised it on their webpage, and they put it on Twitter, and they welcomed the media, and they said that it makes their police department better by supporting all members of their police agency, because they're not just supporting that female officer, they're supporting officer families, right? So it's a support for men or for women who are expanding their families. We do recruit a younger pool. Also, the Charleston Police Department, they're using data collection in order to ensure that they have strategic planning for recruitment. So they're looking at what groups they're missing and how to target that specific group, and then creating a strategy to access that group and to see what works and what doesn't. They're keeping very a close look on their data in order to expand the strategy, or to enhance the strategy, or maybe they have to go back to the drawing board. And a lot of what we're seeing in the videos is that they're more realistic. Often you had police agencies that would advertise that they're hiring, right? And they'll put some big macho guy hanging off the back of a SWAT truck or a helicopter. And the agency doesn't have a SWAT truck or a helicopter, right? And so make it more realistic as to what the job really is about. So we have this ideal in policing, right? That, you know, it's all based on culture and tradition, but it's not really what cops do on a day-to-day basis, right? I tell cops a lot of what you do is social work, and they cringe. I'm not a social worker. And I'll say, well, look at your log sheet. You went from interpersonal conflict to domestic violence to a landlord-tenant matter. All you do is mediate conflict all day long. Your job more closely resembles that of a social worker, where you need good communication skills and interpersonal conflict skills than, you know, that of some SWAT guy, right? That's catching bank robbers, right? That may happen, but it's not the majority of police work. And I think we have to recruit more geared to those skills that someone who's dealing with interpersonal conflict could succeed with, right? Communication skills, critical thinking skills, de-escalation. And so those traits, right, de-escalation skills, there are things that women tend to do better because they tend to be good communicators, even though a lot of men are good communicators. So we should be looking for those skill sets in everyone we recruit, right? But it just so happens that if you go after this group, right, women innately tend to be better communicators. And some female police chiefs will argue that they created de-escalation before it was a term, right? You try to get someone to come down to where you're at so you don't have to go hands-on, right? So you can resolve the situation without anyone getting hurt. So I think looking at those promising practices, sharing them and taking a close look at, you know, what we say we want and if we're really recruiting for what we say we want, being intentional in that.
Jon, I'd like to take it to you. You know, you were on the task force, and one of the things that you know a lot about is diversity, especially if with disabilities. How does that play into the culture within a police agency, and how could you increase representation among people who may not have the normal physical, I guess, prerequisites that cops are always looking for, and how could that help an agency?
So I think, you know, the troubling thing that I learned very quickly in speaking with Dr. Kringen is that there is not a lot of research with respect to diversity of the disability community representation within police forces across the country. As a backdrop, what I can tell you is that the United States Department of Labor currently reports that the disability community is the single largest minority in the country, 50 million people. And so when you try to crack that nut, one of the things that I think about in looking at our current police is there are a significant number of invisible disabilities in, right? So you won't see them. They're not physical. It's not a visual thing. And so I think that the first thing that police departments might consider doing is taking an inventory of their current police force, and on a voluntary basis, not mandatory, because there's, you know, HIPAA considerations here and such, but take a look at their current police forces and say, anybody here have a disability that they would be willing to disclose? And start with that as your baseline. And then speak to those individuals, because those are the individuals living with lived experience on how we might be able to recruit other persons with disabilities to come and try to join the police force. Now, there may be testing issues also, accessibility with testing issues that might be an immediate disqualifier for a number of disabilities. That's another thing that needs to be addressed. But as we get, I know we're going to talk later about non-sworn positions, civilian positions. That's another avenue that police departments can look at as a way of incorporating the disability community within the department. You know, it's one of these things, one of the main themes of today's discussion is seeing people in the police department that look like me, right? Well, the reality is, you know, I'm in a wheelchair. I know you can't see it on the screen here. I'm not going to see a police person rolling a beat, if you will. It's just not going to happen. I understand that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't policemen and women that are walking the streets of our towns and cities that don't have some sort of disability of some kind. I think of things like trauma, right? Policemen and women are human beings first. They may not have walked into a job with the police with a disability, but as a result of experiences within their work, they could be victims of trauma. That's a disability, right? And so it's things like that that we need to consider, that, you know, policemen and women they're people first, and we need them to speak their stories, especially those within the disability community. That's a great way to encourage other people within the disability community to aspire to be policemen and women themselves. So I apologize if I rambled on there, Andrew.
No, that's great. Broad
Andrew,
question for, yeah, go
let me
ahead.
just jump in there for a minute. Let me just bridge the gap between the wonderful things that Ivonne said and the wonderful things that Jon said. First of all, we've got a branding problem in policing, because when we send people out to recruit, we typically send the most physically fit, most macho people out there, and we give them the romanticized version of policing, the SWAT, the chasing, and what we see on television, the running, the jumping, the shooting, the sliding across the hood of a police car, when that's actually not what policing is. And what happens is when people, particularly people in impoverished communities and often communities of color, when they see that, those images are traumatizing to those communities. So I'm not going to be part of something that traumatizes me, because when you look at policing, and I tend not to say law enforcement, because enforcing criminal laws as it applies to index crime is only about 20% of what the police actually do. The vast majority of their job are administrative or service. So if we can push that out, and if we can get departments in general to understand that community policing is not a strategy, it's a philosophy. So if we can push that out to let people know these are the things that we're going to do. We're in the process of building bridges. We're trying to help, bring communities and police officers together. And as much as we want the police to build bridges this way, we need community members to build bridges this way. But I'm not going to build a bridge towards you if everything I see about you is bringing up trauma and triggers me.
Andrew, if I could just jump in also and just say, with respect to statistics in the disability community, it's underreported. So if the USDOL is telling us that we have 50 million people in the United States that have a disability, those are the people that are telling us that. This is a significantly underreported number, and as such, it's a significantly overlooked population when it comes to employment, not just within the police department, but across the country. Or across the board. I know we're talking about the police here, but that's something to seriously think about. I mean, Dr. Kringen's presentation highlights the very view of what people think diversity is. It's race and gender. When you look at things through the lens of disability, it's disability and. I'm disabled and I'm a woman. I'm disabled and I'm African American. There's a universality to disability in that it spans all races, all cultures, all genders, sexual identities and preferences and so forth. And that's a really, really critical and important thing to continue to keep in mind when thinking about DEI.
Let me ask this question, and anyone can answer here. What are some concrete things then that can be changed? Ivonne, you talked about family, paid family leave and making that part of being able to recruit more women into the police workforce. What other concrete steps could be taken or policy changes could be made to try and make this work more accepting or an easier transition for somebody who may actually want to be a police officer?
So I was thinking about what Jon was mentioning, right, with disabilities and policing, right? There's this stigma behind reporting that you may be suffering from mental problems due to stress, the environment that you're in, repeated exposure to trauma. And most of these officers keep it to themselves because they worry about getting forced out. And that's exactly right what happens. Many police officers, if they say the word stress, get forced out. But if we look at it through a lens of being inclusive, right, of thinking about these segments where there's intersectionality, right, where there may be disability or race or gender compounded, you can really expand the pool of people that you're recruiting from, right, and lived experiences with a better understanding of what community members may be experiencing. I know the Department of Corrections here in New Jersey has hired people with prosthetic legs. In Newark, where I came from, we hired individuals with maybe a hearing aid or had speech impediments, right? But going beyond this image of you have to fit this very strict criteria of physicality in order to come on the job, instead of looking overall traits that this individual can come in. And this is really controversial in policing because they want to think of these individuals that they're hiring as, these warriors. But again, it's revisiting what you think of when you imagine a police officer. Is it a public servant, right? Or is it, this warrior type that you're thinking about? And when you look at the military, their physical fitness standards at times tend to be lower than police departments, right? But the military is recruiting soldiers. The police department themselves are supposed to be recruiting public servants. So we have to look at the criteria and what we're hiring in order to expand our pool so that it is more inclusive and includes more of the community that we're serving, right? So Jon and Lorenzo's, Dr. Boyd's comments made me think of that we are overlooking large swaths that we could be recruiting from, especially now where there's this recruitment crisis where applications are down and we're looking for people that really have it in them to be public servants and not these soldier warriors.
Well, and I think, Ivonne, another thing that is really important to remember is it's getting them in the door, but it's also retention, right? So through the whole training process and, what are the messages that are sort of sent during these processes that make people say, especially if you have a skill set, that lies beyond policing, maybe this isn't for me, right? Maybe I'd rather be doing something else with my skill set. And so being able to keep people in the door once they're there, because they can love the job, they can love serving their community, but if they don't feel like they fit with their organization, then they're not going to stay, right? And we see that across the board, whether it's within law enforcement or other types of organizations, tech, et cetera, where they've struggled with women in the workforce.
And to your point, the reason why the goal with 30 by 30 is that 30% is because of representative bureaucracy theory, right? That a marginalized group can't advocate for themselves or change the culture until they reach that tipping point of 30% where they feel safe enough to stick their necks out and voice their concerns and advocate for themselves. So unless we bring in a diverse pool of people, that culture is never going to change because it's going to be that same ideology, the same folks in charge, and that culture is going to stay frozen, right? It's not going to change at all. So it's going to take a shift, but the folks that get there have to feel comfortable and welcome. It's not enough just to bring them in, then to suffer in a culture that's toxic.
Andrew, if I could just jump in and make just two very quick comments. I wanted to speak to Yvonne's comment about stigma, and she's absolutely right. There is a stigma within the disability community that if I disclose, there could be some retaliatory measures taken against me. And it's an important one to acknowledge because we just need to do a better job of creating cultures that are more welcoming and open and accepting to people disclosing that information, because it only stands to benefit everyone from a diversity standpoint. And then very quickly, I wanted to just speak to Dr. Kringen's comment about retention. There are studies out there that show that hiring persons with disabilities can significantly increase your retention rates. So there's something to consider as well. Thank you.
All great points. Let's move to the third recommendation that was cited in the lead up to this conversation, which was potentially establishing a diversity, equity, and inclusion unit within the post council in Connecticut. I think Sergeant Austin made the point that outside forces are only going to do so much oversight from the state level or whatever is only going to change a police culture so much. Is this idea of creating a DEI unit within post important in that respect, and how can that work with the local efforts to try to diversify their officers? Lorenzo, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, if you look at policing as a whole nationwide, if you can step out of Connecticut for a moment, policing is a white male dominated occupation. People in policing tend to be white, male, conservative, cisgendered, fully able. And that's the mentality that we get. So if we start looking at other things, if we look at levels of intersectionality, if the police could then look more like the community, there are people with different gender identities, people with different levels of ability, people with different racial or ethnic backgrounds. And if we stop moving out the traditional view of policing, but again, the people in power are the ones that are going to want to keep power. But again, if we can diversify even, ideology and not have that ultra conservative policing view and move people more towards the middle, more toward the center, at least to have people understand the communities that they're policing, I think that's a huge step in the right direction. And the other thing I would like to say is, if we have people from the community, way back in 2010, I published an article called Light Blue versus Dark Blue that looked at attitude differences between Black and white police officers in quality of life policing. Because the biggest issue is not the shooting, is not the murders. The biggest issues that people complain about are quality of life issues. And when you have community members that can identify with the police, or flipping it around, having police officers that are from the community, when they're off duty and they're at the grocery store, or if they're at church, or they're at the gym, they're seeing the same people that they are serving, protecting. And then they've got a better understanding of the community, of the norms and the mores of the community, and they won't seem like an occupying army of outsiders. So there's never, ever, ever not a good reason to push issues of diversity. Avoiding diversity will be done to your own peril.
How does the state help local municipalities in Connecticut? Obviously, there's a lot of local police forces in Connecticut. Being a reporter from other states, I was actually shocked by just the makeup of Connecticut, all of the small municipalities, the towns. It's a little different than other states I've worked in. How can the post council, if this was created, help to the local police forces push this idea of diversity and help change their culture? Or is it a overstep? Would that actually be detrimental? I don't know.
It's not an overstep at all. And there are small steps going in the right direction. For instance, there's a social justice subcommittee that Chief Riddick runs. And it's about bringing in these different ideas. And the more we can bring in ideas, the more you can get Black and brown chiefs, the more you can get other people in command that can come to the table and to post council, to let them see that we're not that different from you. We all want the same thing. So it's not an overstep at all. I think it should be an absolute requirement.
Would anybody else like to address the state's role in all of this and trying to make sure this filters down, not just to the large municipalities in Connecticut, but also to suburban outlying areas, which was brought up early in this conversation?
I think Post plays a critical role, right? They establish the policies, the criteria for the academies that usually can result in large wholesale dismissals. So for instance, in New Jersey, a change in the Post standards on the fitness exam wound up with women getting eliminated from the police academy at rates between 60 and 85%. And this wasn't something that chiefs wanted. Chiefs were waiting 2 and 3 years to put these recruits in, only to lose them at the academy. These were decisions that were made by the heads of the academy, but then they themselves weren't looking at the data or weren't interested in what the data said. You know, it took a journalist going in there and filing a request for 10 years of records to show that this was happening starting in 2015, when it should have been something that the academy was keeping a close eye on to see where they were losing people and why. If in the military, again, as I mentioned before, they were losing that many recruits, that person in charge of that boot camp would lose their jobs, right? This should be something of a concern that you should be addressing and determining whether, the reason why these people are being eliminated is valid to make a qualified law enforcement officer, or if it's some arbitrary standard that you put in place and really doesn't measure the quality of that officer and the services that they're going to provide. So having the post being correct and running appropriately and looking at their data is critical. They have to have the right standards in place in order to reach the goals that we're talking about here.
I agree with that also. You don't know, part of the problem is you don't know what you don't know until you know what you don't know. And that's the importance of diversity of thought, ideology, ethnicity, and the like that we're discussing here. For example, I'll give you a quick anecdotal story. Along the way, working through the ranks, I spoke to several female officers who weren't taking promotional exams, and it drove me crazy. It's just like, why would you not want to get to that next level? Why would you not want to aspire to be a chief like Chief Roman? And several of the officers says, Chief, do you understand? Like in our household, we are the primary caregivers, and our husbands are out working. So we're working too, but the primary responsibility for our children rests with us. And for me to continue to work our way up, I'm going to have to change my schedule and everything else and totally disrupt our household. And it's easier this way. Totally blew my mind. Never even considered that. But that's why diversity of thought, the conversation comes in, and why the importance is through posts or whatever. I think it has to be more grassroots, and the guidelines come through posts. And once we explain the importance of diversity of thought and how it can enhance and improve your police department, then hope we get some change. Thank you.
Well taken.
I don't think it's realistic to have individual small departments change on their own, because if they could have changed on their own, they would have changed on their own. So there needs to be some sort of oversight. And I'm not saying that it needs to be legislative, but at least with post council, there needs to be some oversight. And to borrow the term from Johnny Cochran in the OJ trial, in his final summation, when he asked rhetorically, who polices the police? Well, right now we have an opportunity for post council to keep the police, on the right track and divert and go in the right direction. So I think that post council has a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that diversity happens.
We've talked a lot about the sworn officers that make up police departments to this point. We can't go without considering here then the civilian staff that back those officers up, provide all types of different roles within the departments and services. Let's talk about how diversity could work with that group of civilian employees. How important is it to have civilians within your department and the diversity within them? Would anybody like to take that question?
I believe having civilians, Black and brown civilians in our agency is huge. I mean, we have social workers who are embedded with our major crimes division. We have those who work with our special investigative detectives in our juvenile and our human trafficking divisions. And they bring a empathetic view to what's going on in our community. I mean, it goes back again, just knowing. When I came on the job, I was assigned a footbeat. And I was a little older, and I had a 21-year-old kid, and I'll call him a kid because at the time I was much older than him. And he had never, ever been out of his rural town. Hartford was his first assignment. He had never actually been to Hartford outside of actually getting a job and working. They put us in the North End, which is the most, if you want to say it, it's a segregated section of Connecticut that's probably 99.9% Black. There's a lot of people hanging out outside of a 3-story walk-up. His first impression was that they must be selling drugs or doing something suspicious. And I said, bro, it's June 18th. It's 85 degrees out. There's no central air in that building. They're hot. They're outside because they have no air conditioning. The fans just circulate hot air, and there's nowhere else to go. Everyone that you see is not a criminal. Economics drives, like I said, the social economic situation will drive you to sit outside. And I know Chief Roman, working in Newark, I'm sure you've experienced a lot of those same situations, and with people coming in, not recognizing the fact that, hey, what, you don't have an air condition? You don't have central air? No, we don't have that here.
No.
I grew up in those kind of situations. So I always talk to young officers or people who are thinking about coming to work in these type of challenging areas. You have to look at the conditions that people are living in and surviving in, and try to put yourself in their shoes. And what would you do? Not necessarily going to the criminal activity portion of it, but just to get through the day. Having those civilians working in the agency, just based on the data and the numbers, helps those detectives, helps those officers navigate those type of situations, especially when you're going to go in and talk to a family. So you're not coming in and being dismissive. And I think that helps the conversation and the transparency and the working, because yes, the community has to work with us and we need that. But we also have to make sure that we understand what we're dealing with and how we're going to help them and treat their situation with respect. I know someone said protect and serve, but I like to go a step further, because if you don't respect the community that you're serving, you will never give them your full protection. You just won't. And I've always believed, hey, we need to have that respect should be the very first thing before we say protect and serve, because protection, who are we protecting? Because I've seen many times that we've gave better protection to those who come in to our communities to come to see a concert or to a baseball game or to a country music than the residents who actually live here, and we give them the service that they should not have and stuff. So that to me, the respect, it's a two-way street, but we need to understand that and have that empathy going forward. So yes, I believe those people should be embedded with our agency. We should look to hire more social, and it touches on so many other areas, like, you know, needing more Black and brown people in social work, needing more Black and brown people in mental health, needing more Black and brown people and educators, so that all these people in all these different areas of expertise are working together to formulate, so we can have just something better. And I go, you know, you spoke about posts, but you know, we have a lot of small towns, and when you start putting, you know, the people will push back, and it's just been my experience, and I'm watching. I mean, we're watching it now as we speak. I mean, there's whole social media platforms devoted to pushing back now against this backlash of what George Floyd, all for me, was not new. Derek Chauvin had done that. What he did many times. He just got caught. That was not his first time doing that. And anyone who would say, "Oh, that was an anomaly," that wasn't. He did that. He was too comfortable. And those kind of things are something that I saw growing up, and many people saw it, but they couldn't bring it forward, because if you made a complaint in the 70s, then you were turned around. The complaint was turned on you. It just was. And now that we have more, a more representative personnel here in Hartford, and even across the city council and our politicians and stuff, we are getting better service. We're getting better, but we can do a lot better. And so yes, having those civilians embedded with our agencies and just agencies across the state, I think would be huge. And that's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
Would anybody else like to speak to that, of the importance of, you know, diversity of ideology too, from, you know, in the civilian staff, and how that can work? John, I see your.
Andrew, yeah, again, I would just want to echo or, you know, expand a little bit on what I said before. If if there are certain physical requirements to be a police officer, particularly one that's going to be patrolling or being on a specific beat, but there are other positions within the department that don't have those requirements. What a great opportunity that would be to bring in and hire individuals from the disability community, and then to be able to have somebody from a disability community, go into the police station to talk to somebody and see somebody like them behind the desk in some fashion. There's an incredible power to that, and something that should very seriously be considered and not overlooked.
Where does this leave us then as we go forward here in Connecticut? I know obviously we're not unique. Again, I've worked in other states and everybody seems to be wrestling with this issue if they are in fact considering it. So what should we be left with?
I think we start with the general acknowledgement from the policing side that diversity is not a bad thing. That diversity is something that, we should strive for. And to quote the chief, you don't know what you don't know until policing as an institution brings in more people and embraces more people, because a lot of times you see the female officer or the officers of color still not being brought in. They're not blue enough to be part of the institution, but other times they're also not Black enough to be part of their home community. So that's a weird place for them to stand. But again, the easier place would be if we can get policing to embrace something other than what it is, to move the needle a little bit. Again, we're not trying to 100% in one day. Like 30 by 30 is a great idea. It's incremental change. We're going from none to some and from some to more. It's a process. The institution of policing in the United States hasn't changed a whole lot in the last 200 years. I would argue that we've seen the bulk of the change in the last 20 years. So we're going in the right direction. We just need to kind of accentuate this and push it further.
And if I may add, I think that police agencies have to identify within themselves the credible messengers that can sell that diversity isn't going to weaken police departments. There's this knee-jerk reaction that if you diversify police agencies, that you're talking about lowering standards. And that in and of itself, I think, speaks to supremacy, that the automatic reaction is that if we're going to diversify, you're going to weaken police departments. It's going to mean a lowering of standards, as if you couldn't diversify and still have an excellent police force. It's because it doesn't meet the narrative, the image that they have of what policing means. So you have to be able to sell that and to show concrete examples. So for instance, I've trained a group of women and we would meet up in the park, and in the union page, automatically people were like, oh, great, affirmative action. I'm like, no, I literally said, I'm going to meet up in the park and train women on how to pass this exam. Nothing about, giving them an unfair advantage, nothing about changing the standards, but the automatic reaction was that, somehow it was an unfair advantage for them to be meeting up in the park. So the messaging has to start from within, where people call out this kind of behavior that in and of itself shows that, there's this idea of supremacy, that one candidate is better than the other. And until you fix that culture inside, it's really not going to be prepared for the people that you're trying to diversify the agency with, because they're still walking into that toxic environment.
Excellent point, Chief. I'm just dying laughing because, anytime a group, I shouldn't say anytime, many times if a persons of colors, officers of colors, if we meet as a group, well, what's this special meeting? What's going on? But each and every day, the majority meets all the time and there's no issues. Why is that? It just doesn't make sense. And to Dr. Boyd's point and Chief Roman, there's this view that diversifying a force is taking away from something else when it's not. It's just providing an opportunity. We're just saying expand your web, cast your net broader in the efforts to edify your own police department, first of all, education, and have a better relationship with your communities, no matter what your community looks like. Just not having a monolithic PD will expand you. So thank you for bringing up many of those good points. And a really quick anecdotal story, the importance of diversification, how people see things differently. I was a patrol officer. A white officer went to a black church for a larceny call. That was it. He went in, he took the call, he came out, and I don't know why we were starting to talk about this call. That he talks to me and he says, hey, I really felt uncomfortable in the church. And I'm like, well, what happened? Did they say something to you? Did they treat you bad? He says, actually, no. They offered me food. They offered me something to drink. They were extremely nice. I said, well, why are you there? He said, well, someone's pocketbook got stolen. And I said, well, why did you feel that way? He says, well, I was the only white person in the room. And I felt uncomfortable, and I felt that people didn't like me, and they were staring at me. And he got treated perfectly. And then my response to him is says, well, I'm not sure why you felt that way. You're probably not used to that. But when I go to roll call, there's times I'm in a room full of police officers and I'm the only person of color. How do you think I might feel trying to embrace this profession and to do my job each and every day? So it ended up being a nice conversation, but it just shows you don't know what you don't know until you know what you don't know.
We're done with the panelist portion here. We're going to take some questions from members of the audience. We'll actually start with one from Ann here. Why is it so difficult for those in law enforcement to admit when they are wrong or have made mistakes? This minimizes, negates their level of trust in the community. So I guess we'll open up that question. Why is it so hard for police to sometimes admit fault?
I would argue that it's not hard, it's just unusual, because we don't have a really good track record of holding police accountable, particularly bad officers. And to go back to, to follow Sergeant Austin's point about Derek Chauvin, the smug look on his face, he had no even inkling, I guess, that he would be held accountable for this. So we don't have a level of accountability. And I would argue holding bad officers, holding rogue officers accountable is not only good for society, but it's good for good cops that are out there. Because, I remember when I was in uniform, when the Rodney King thing happened, people treated me like crap when the week before, I was like the prince of the community. And it's funny how we paint everybody with a broad brush, but if we can hold bad people accountable, then there are going to be more people that are willing to step up. And the second part is, and when I do training for commanders, I talk about the restorative process. When your people come to you and say, hey, Chief, Sarge, Lieutenant, I made a mistake, can you make that a teachable moment for them? Because there's this level of accountability. If you do something bad, I automatically punish you, as opposed to you did a misstep. Can we make it a teachable moment? Can we fix what happened? Can we restore trust in the community? And if we do a paradigm shift and start thinking about it that way and move away from the enforcement part and move toward the bridge building part, that's a step in the right direction.
Would anyone else like to address that question?
I think the question is spot on. It's a cultural thing that's been on for centuries in our profession. It's okay to be transparent and to make a mistake. The other part of this, again, culture, police culture is, I think some of the really egregious actions, you can have uniformity. People talked about Derek Chauvin. Well, to me, that was easy. What about Walter Scott? And why wasn't there a big, huge uproar about that? Eric Gardner and issues like that. In those type of situations, police officers sometimes substitute themselves and say, well, what if that was me and I just made a mistake? And now they're concerned about their job, their well-being, so they're reticent to come forward. Whereas we're trying to get better with this. Just acknowledge there's a mistake. and you deserve to be disciplined. And you need not to put yourself in that situation to have that outcome that just occurred. And again, Dr. Boyd is 100% correct. Some things could be teachable moment. It could be training, but sometimes you need discipline. And in some cases, it does mean termination. You just can't do it. We have to acknowledge when we're wrong.
I also think Chief Riddick talks about culture, and I also wonder how much of this also lies within supervisors as well, right? And so being able to say, if you make a wrong decision for your unit, hey, I might need to pivot or do something differently. But a lot of times when I've talked to officers, they say sort of their leadership, it goes silent if they feel like they did something wrong, right? And so some of this is modeling behavior by saying, hey, I'm hearing, or I made it, I should have made a different type of decision. This is why I made the decision I did, but being sort of transparent so that later on, when we're asking officers to be transparent, they know I've seen it from my supervisor, from my direct line.
Another question here from Maya Bowen. How is respect of humanity despite ethnicity expressed as part of the training exercises for cadets and professional development for senior members of the police department?
I'll jump in on this. I will say we have made tremendous strides in this area, and I'm talking about Connecticut. I use my own personal experience. When I went to the academy way back in 92, 93, when we were taught, we didn't even talk about these subjects as people. They were dealt like with objects. It was always the enemy or these other derogatory terms, but it was never the human component of the people. And everybody else was wrong. And the officer had to go home. My job is I have to go home at night. Well, do you realize what you're saying? If you're going to that extreme, is why we had that culture of these many officer involved shootings and some of these serious injuries that have occurred because of that mindset. Is it might be a minor reaction or somebody just resisting arrest, and now we go to lethal force. Whereas now we are taught and we're teaching dignity, respect, and we've got a ways to go. And to really humanize and see that people who make mistakes sometimes are just having a bad day. And just like you can have a bad day. We still have a ways to go, but that was a very good point. And I've seen a change, but we still have much further to go.
I agree 100% with Chief Riddick on that. And he said he was in the academy in 1993, and I was in the academy in 2003. And I still heard those terms. And, we have, at the end of the day, at the end of your shift, you go home to your family. That's first and foremost, you're taught that. I came on the job and I had an FTO tell me, hey, Steve, you got to know how to handle these people. And he was a white guy and I'm looking at him like, well, you do know I grew up right here on this block. What people you were referring to? So I'm just kind of curious, when you said handle these people or, so this mindset, this thing, and then just to kind of go back to the accountability, again, it's not just police. We take our cues from those above us. So when we see the prosecutors hiding or suppressing evidence that would lead to people who have been arrested getting found not guilty, or judges suppressing evidence, people from these Black and brown communities see this stuff on a regular basis. I challenge anyone to go to any major GA 14 here in Hartford. I don't know what the GA is in Bridgeport or New Haven, but go to those GAs and look in the courtroom and look in the galleys and look who's represented. And if you see that, then you can say, well, are these the only people committing crimes? Or are these the only people getting arrested for crimes? And you see, and we see that, we recognize that, and we live that. And then we see the decisions coming from the judges, the prosecutors, and the police. We're the low-hanging fruit. So we're the guys that are actually making the arrests, so we're easy to point to. And unfortunately, these communities are hurting from that. they feel as though, our word is not going to be taken. Our stories are not going to be heard. They're not going to be believed. And this is a lot of the mistrust that we've had over the years. And we talk about the misinformation. And like I said, social media does a wonderful job of putting, profiles. I so hate to see whenever there's a crime committed and the local news stations will put up a wanted picture or an individual, and it's always the worst picture. It's always this black or brown person whose profile is put out there, and this is being sent out and disseminated to the entire state and or the entire region. And these are the images that people are reinforcing, negative images that they're reinforcing in individuals' minds. So when you have these carjackings around the state, for instance, they show these young men and women. Now every young man and woman in the state becomes a potential suspect. I have a young son that wears the little hairstyles that the kids wear. He is now a potential suspect because he wears that hairstyle. I live in a suburban community. So I'm constantly, and people say, well, why do you talk to him? I have to talk to him. He has to be aware of what's going on. I don't want him to be mislabeled or seen if he's going to get gas in a gas station. Someone has to fear him. He's not a fearful young man, because we don't paint all white teenagers one way. A guy can go into a church and kill a whole congregation. We'll take him to Burger King and get him a hamburger. We see videos where we see a 13 or 14-year-old girl slammed on the ground in a bikini because she's a threat. I mean, she's wearing a two-piece bathing suit. So these images have power. And so these are some of the things that we must confront and we must look at as they move, not just down to the law enforcement part, but also in the actual justice and the restorative justice that we're talking about, because we wouldn't need all these innocent projects if the fact of the matter was people were getting justice from the arrest right on through the process.
Well taken. We're going to do one last question here, and then we're going to wrap up. This is from Lisa Tepper Bates. She asks, a sad fact about Connecticut is that we are a very segregated state in terms of demographics, community to community. Many towns are majority white, often by a large margin, and at the same time, they are very close to urban areas that have large non-white populations. How should we think about the composition of police forces in those towns, in these towns? Feel free to jump in.
It would make sense if people only shopped or traveled in their own community. But the fact is that people from Hartford go to Glastonbury, they go to West Hartford, they go to Meriden. People move outside of geographic areas. So it makes sense that we would diversify all of the departments around it, not just the major cities, because diversity, the question that I have when people talk about not wanting their towns diverse, my question is, do you want the money from these non-diverse people? And if people are coming in there spending money, adding to your tax base, they should get a level of service as well. So diversifying departments, because a lot of your tax base and a lot of your the people coming in spending money tend to be non-diverse. That's the perfect reason to diversify your department, even in these non-diverse towns.
Anyone else like to follow that up?
Another problem is, and I know there's some other chiefs in Connecticut, especially those that lead towns with lack of diversity. Many times you'll have candidates who don't want to go to those towns because they'll be the only one or one of two. So I'd much rather feel comfortable going to a more diverse police department. So that's a problem we have to overcome. It's difficult. I'll be fully transparent. I felt that way when I first came into law enforcement. A lot of the smaller police departments that didn't have any diversity, I just and it might have just been me because of my upbringing. I know it's definitely part of it. I didn't have an interest. I'd much rather go to a place that had some diversity already. So it's the chicken and the egg, right? How do you come out of a problem unless you take that step to fix the problem? So that is difficult.
I'm going to toss it back to Andrew Clark now. We're going to wrap this up and he can take us out of here.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you to all of our panelists for a very enlightening discussion today. It accomplished exactly what we were hoping for, becoming better educated about what the Police Transparency and Accountability Task Force was recommending, but also casting a net so that we could find other experts, both nationally and locally, to help with the implementation guide. And I know there was a few other questions left in the chat. And I would just say, if you're interested in participating with the task force and in the implementation guide, keeping this conversation going, please just do reach out to us. You can reach out through the ctpolicetransparency.com website. This is the last in the series that we had planned. But as I know Sergeant Austin mentioned, the media part of it, we have been mulling about having a separate conversation on media and the role that that plays within the general sense of what needs to or could be done in the state. And so we'll look for something on that potentially in the future. So this is, as I mentioned, the last one we have. We plan to put out an implementation guide within a few months' time. You can look out for that as well. And hopefully this will be on CTN. We thank them for hosting these videos on the site, and appreciate everyone's time today. Good to see everyone, and thank you for the conversation. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.